So France 1968 holds a special place in the history of the left, and it remains an important story for us today. While there have been other student-led movements across the globe with varying levels of intensity, success, what set France apart was how it had led to a general strike, a strike that lasted 3 weeks and saw participation of up to 10 million workers, making it the largest general strike up until then. And what makes it even more significant, especially for us here in Canada, is that it took place in a stable, functioning, liberal democracy. Unlike revolutions that often occur in politically unstable or authoritarian regimes, France 1968 showed us that even in prosperous democratic societies, deep societal discontent can lead to moments of mass upheaval. Although, regrettably, it did not achieve the revolutionary outcome many hoped for, it taught us an enduring lesson that without the labor of workers, the machinery of society grinds to a halt. This power lies at the heart of workers' ability to resist and challenge state authority. In Nantes, workers at the height of the strike took control of the local economy by occupying factories, public services, and even media outlets. The strike committees effectively managed the distribution of essential goods, ensuring the population's needs were met while the state's authority was undermined. Now, to give some context for what was going on at the time, globally, 1968 was a year marked with widespread anti-establishment movements, many of which were fueled by disillusionment and traditional forms of power and governments. Across the world, youth, students, and marginalized groups were rising up against war, capitalism, and authoritarian regimes. In the United States, the civil rights movement and the anti-Vietnam War protests were at their peak, with students playing a leading role in challenging both racial injustice and American imperialism. Across Eastern Europe, the Prague Spring emerged as an attempt to challenge Soviet control. In Latin America, revolutionary movements sought to overthrow military dictatorships and fight US dominance in the region. Even in Japan and Mexico, students were taking to the streets, challenging the government's policies. This global wave of uprisings reflected a growing frustration with the failures of both capitalist democracies and authoritarian regimes to address inequality, repression, and exploitation. The youth, particularly students, became a driving force, connecting their struggles with broader anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist sentiments worldwide. In France, however, the revolution seemed highly unlikely. France at the time was experiencing a period of economic growth known as Trente Glorieuses, 30 glorious years translated. Post-war reconstruction had led to rising living standards. Consumerism was flourishing. Unemployment was relatively low. And politically, Charles de Gaulle, a national hero from World War II, was in power, and his leadership seemed secure. De Gaulle's government had brought France stability after the war, and many viewed his regime as strong and capable of handling unrest. So the notion of a revolution in such a seemingly functional liberal democracy appeared far-fetched at the time. And also labor and trade unions at the time were largely subdued. They focused on negotiating incremental improvements like wages and working conditions rather than pushing for radical change. Lastly, leading up to May 1968, the main focus of social unrest was the growing student movement. While students around the world were protesting issues such as the Vietnam War, authoritarian university structures, and societal conservatism, their protests were often seen as isolated incidents, more ideological than systemic. In France, the initial demonstration at Nanterre University and Sorbonne were seen as classic student grievances, not the precursor to a wider movement. Most did not anticipate the students' dissatisfaction with the education system would spark a broad social and labor movement, let alone one that would involve millions of workers and nearly bring the government down. So what happened? Despite the economic growth of post-war France, workers were deeply dissatisfied due to several factors. One, the wages were stagnant, even though the economy was expanding. The workers' wages did not keep pace with increasing cost of living and inflation. The benefits of growth were disproportionately felt by the middle and upper classes. The many workers felt alienated under the capitalist system where their labor was treated as a commodity. The assembly line nature of industrial work reduced workers to cogs in a machine with little control or fulfillment in their daily tasks. Workers were working long hours under unsafe conditions with limited labor rights. The lack of significant reforms in workplace safety and worker protection fueled anger and frustration. And the workers, even though they were in a democratic state, their grievances were often mediated through trade unions, but the unions were more focused on securing incremental economic gains. And workers felt that their demands were filtered and diluted by a political system that prioritized stability over substantive change. Now, the post-war baby boom had produced a generation of young people who were increasingly dissatisfied with the rigidity and authoritarianism of French society. This new generation was questioning traditional hierarchies, consumerism, and the alienation they felt under capitalist order. In March 1968, students at Nanterre University initiated protests, citing their frustration with overcrowded classrooms, outdated curricula, and the authoritarian structure of the French university system. This protest soon spread to the Sorbonne in Paris, where a much larger movement took shape. By early May, the student protests had escalated, resulting in the closure of the Sorbonne, and the clashes with the police became increasingly violent. The night of May 10 and 11, now known as the Night of the Barricades, was a turning point. Students, rejecting the violent repression of their protest by the police, erected barricades in the Latin Quarter of Paris. These makeshift defenses became iconic symbols of the rebellion. Police forces responded with brutality, and the clash between students and the riot police led to a wave of public outrage. What had started as a university protest was now becoming something much larger. This protest quickly spread beyond the university. French workers who had long been facing stagnant wages and poor working conditions saw in the student uprising a moment of solidarity. By mid-May, over 10 million workers had gone on strike, the largest general strike in French history. Factories were occupied, workplaces shut down, and the capitalist economy of France came to a grinding halt. The mass mobilization of workers was unprecedented and transformed what had begun as a student movement into a potential revolution. For a few weeks, it seemed like France might be on the brink of something transformative. President de Gaulle, alarmed by the scale of the uprising, even fled the country briefly to a military base in Germany, fearing the government might collapse. Yet, despite widespread strikes, factory occupations, and mass mobilization, the revolutionary movement began to fizzle out. By late June, de Gaulle had regained control. His government dissolved the National Assembly and called for elections. In the elections that followed, de Gaulle's party won an overwhelming majority, and the conservative forces in France, in French society, reasserted their dominance. The strikes began to lose momentum as trade unions negotiated wage increases and other concessions with the government. Workers began returning to their jobs, and factories were slowly reopened. So why did this movement, which was so full of potential, ultimately fail? First, while the students and workers shared a sense of frustration with the status quo, their goals were not entirely aligned. The students were pushing for radical systemic change, challenging the very structures of capitalist society, questioning the consumerist culture, and demanding a new liberated way of life. The workers, on the other hand, were primarily focused on economic issues. Their demands were more immediate: higher wages, shorter working hours, and better working conditions. Trade unions, particularly Confédération Générale du Travail, the CGT, played a significant role in channeling worker dissatisfaction towards specific negotiable demands. While millions of workers participated in the strike, the CGT leadership was more focused on securing material gains such as wage increases, shorter working hours, and better working conditions rather than pushing for systemic transformation. Similarly, the French Communist Party, the PCF, also took a cautious and reformist stance, opting to work within the existing political framework to secure gradual reforms, and wary of radicalism and idealism of the student movement. So the conservative approach by the CGT and the PCF effectively limited the potential for a unified revolutionary front. I'll let Lisa talk about the betrayal of these labor organizations. On the other hand, there were the more radical revolutionary left groups, such as the Trotskyists, the Maoists, and the anarchist factions, which were more aligned with the students' vision for systemic change. They believe that the union and the PCF has been co-opted by the state and were standing in the way of true revolutionary potential. However, there were too many fractures in these groups to really develop that kind of unified front. Another point to note, student movements like these are spontaneous and leaderless. While there was incredible energy and momentum, it was a movement without a unified strategy. The absence of a centralized revolutionary vanguard meant that the various factions, the students, workers, trade unions, political parties, were often working at cross purposes. Finally, the conservative forces in France, especially in rural areas, remained largely unmoved by the protests. De Gaulle's call for elections in June 1968 brought a conservative backlash, with many of the French countryside and the middle classes supporting stability over the chaos in the streets. In the end, the French government was able to reassert control. The revolutionary moment passed, but May 1968 left a lasting legacy, particularly in terms of challenging social norms and reshaping French culture. However, it has to be seen as a missed opportunity, an uprising that revealed the contradiction of capitalism, but was unable to transcend them due to the lack of unity and clear revolutionary leadership. So I'll let Lisa talk about why the revolution failed and some other points.
Awesome. Thanks, Zarif. This is actually an enormous topic, and you could probably talk about it for like 8 hours straight. Thank you for summarizing it in less than 15 minutes, Zarif. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about, I think, basically 3 things. Was it a success or a failure? Why? And kind of how could things have been different? I feel like this mic isn't working. Is it okay? Yeah? Okay. Not used to using a big mic like this. More used to Zoom, right? So thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Rajan, for leading us in. And thank you so much, Zara, for summarizing that first part. So I think as workers, it's really important to know our own history, because the ruling class, all they ever tell us is, we're too dumb, we're too selfish, we can't even run our own workplaces, let alone all of society, right? And we may not be aware, but like that message, and I need to start my timer, otherwise I have teacher disease, I will talk too long. So keep it to 15 minutes. We get this message all the time, and we often internalize it, right? We're told that history is about great men, and they usually are men, who, change things, and the rest of us at best are spectators. Well, one of the things that France 1968 showed is that that's not the case, right? That's where workers weren't spectators. They actually took control of production themselves. They showed just a tiny glimpse. I mean, it was only a few weeks, really, of what is possible, and that's why we call it a revolutionary rehearsal. It wasn't a real revolution, but it showed some incredible things, right? And I wouldn't say that it was a victory. I mean, I think most people who look at just what's lost or gained, kind of reminds me of looking at what the encampments, ended up with after that struggle. You got to be honest. Sometimes you don't win anything, but you may have actually, though, have taught people some other lessons. And I think while there wasn't a victory in terms of what was won, I think what French workers showed, and Zarif alluded to this, was that you could have in an advanced capitalist country in the global north, you could have workers show their incredible power and creativity and show that, you know, a revolution could happen in those countries. I know when I was in university, you know, my friends would say, you know, they weren't interested in working with American and Canadian workers because we were just all bought off and we'd never have a revolution. And that's why everyone used to look to Latin America or what have you. And I don't know if that idea still permeates society, but I think that was the first time, you know, as Zarif said, that was the first time you saw that massive general strike in one of those countries, right? You know, so-called liberal democracy. So the interesting thing about a general strike, I think, especially a massive one like the one in France, I really want to move this because I feel like I can't see you. There you go. It's okay. It's not a big deal. I just feel rude talking to the podium. So the interesting thing about a general strike is that, yes, workers stop production, but then they have to, if it goes more than a day, they have to move beyond that because then they need to actually run society because if they don't start producing and distributing things, everyone will starve. You know, there'll be no baby formula, there'll be no diapers, there'll be no food, right? And that means that it brings up the question of power, who gets to decide what we are going to produce and what we aren't and how to distribute it, and who controls that. And then it really puts the working class in that position of having to actually do that thing in a tiny way, maybe only in a city or, you know, in a part of a city. But I think seeing the working class take on running even some aspects of society, even for a short period of time, that's what lets us challenge some of those ruling class ideas about the great men in society. And I think that, I think that's why it's such a powerful example even today, so much later. So although in most parts of France, I would say that, you know, the process of developing democratic workers' control didn't really go super far. There were a few places where it did. And if you're interested in, and as I am, in examples where workers' control, you know, went a bit further, and you can kind of see the beginning of what we would call Soviets, right, or workers' councils. This book is fantastic, and this is the one that Zarif and I'll hold it up for a picture. Cheese. This is the one that, one of the ones that Zarif and I read when we prepared our talks. And if people know about Chile, it may come up in the discussion. There's some other neat examples of revolutionary rehearsals that I think are definitely also worth talking about. But there were some factories and towns, and one of them was Nantes that Zarif talked about, where things went pretty far. They had the beginnings of workers' control. And there was a week at the end of May, for instance, in Nantes, where there was a situation of what we would call dual power. Workers' organizations basically ran the city, and the ruling class kind of sat back and went, oh, holy crow, and they didn't do anything, right? I thought it was funny that Matthew Green last night talked about dual power. I don't think that's what he was talking about exactly, but, you know, it maybe alludes to the same thing that we do have power as workers, right? Yeah. So workers and peasants from the Nantes area, what happened, I'll just give a little bit of the history because I know Zarif didn't have a chance to tell you everything. It's an amazing story, I thought, that from Nantes, they'd set up roadblocks all around the city, and they were controlling everything that came in and out. And workers' committees basically cut out the middleman and made deals with the food producers, the farmers, peasants around the city. Of course, this let prices be way cut, right? It was a lot better. But then, of course, you have to control, right? How do you make sure nobody profiteers? What they did, Ian Burchell wrote in this book, Revolutionary Rehearsals, he said, quote, to ensure that others did not profiteer during the period, shops were obliged to display stickers on their windows stating this shop is authorized to open. Its prices are under permanent supervision by the unions. So that's who was in charge. The stickers bore the signature of the 3 unions that made up a central strike committee, which had effectively taken over administration of the town from the municipal authorities. I can't even imagine what that would be like. I did have a friend who was in Chile during the cordones, I think they called them, and he said the same thing happened there. You know, you got your ticket from the union, you know, for your chicken that you could have for, you know, Saturday night meal, and, you know, any of the business owners, they didn't get a ticket, they didn't get a chicken. Too bad for them, right? And that's how, you know, little piece of workers' control. So this gave people a little taste of what it might look like to have the beginnings of workers' councils or Soviets, to run things democratically. And indeed, if we'd had those democratically elected councils in every workplace and not just, in a few in France, you could have actually had that. There's no reason why you couldn't have had a system of workers' control if a few other things were in place. So why didn't that happen? That's one I wanted to talk about next. Yeah, I'm still good for time. So why did things unfold the way they did? Why was there no revolution? Not only no revolution, but actually reaction, right? The right wing came back in force and actually swept the elections. It was terrible. So what went wrong? So socialists played really big roles in 1968. And as Zarif said, there were a whole bunch of different groups. There were little groupuscules, the little student groups, they called them. There were Maoists, there were Trotskyists. And then there was the big one, the Parti communiste français, the French Communist Party. And some of these groups played a positive role, others a really negative one, sometimes deliberately undermining things. And that's a sad story. Not to be sectarian, but we have to tell the truth as revolutionaries about what happened. So while the strikes at the beginning were pretty spontaneous, for instance, the first really big factory occupation was Sud Aviation, right, airplane mechanics, on May 14th. That was just a spontaneous strike, so the union leadership didn't call that strike. But, spontaneous actions are never totally spontaneous. There's always something leading up to them. And actually, there had been actions at that place building to that moment. The union leaders, of course, tried to make it a one-day strike. I've experienced that myself in my union when they want to kind of let us blow off steam, but they don't want us to get too radical. And it probably would have been only a one-day strike, except in this plant, there was a history of militancy. There were a few Trotskyists. They were part of a different union, Force Ouvrière, not the communist-controlled union. And they'd been agitating, I guess, for a while among their co-workers, arguing for the idea of a general strike, for solidarity with other workers. And this is just one example, one workplace, where an individual, sometimes revolutionary, could have a really big impact if they had roots, right? You have to have a relationship with people, otherwise they're not going to listen to you about your ideas, about your strike. So people with good politics who had some roots, even if it was sometimes one worker in a workplace, they really had a disproportionate impact in this case. And they were able in some of the plants to argue for occupation when the union bureaucrats were arguing for demobilization. So why did the movement fail? Well, one of the things that happened is the Communist Party, the PCF, I guess I should use the English words, the PCF and the union that they pretty much controlled, the CGT, they really bear a big responsibility. At first, I thought it was just that they had mistaken ideas. When I learned about what happened in France, they actually deliberately demobilized things. Like, it's pretty shocking. And they helped end the strikes. So union leaders, especially in the CGT, they really wanted a negotiated end to the strike. I think that's very common with union bureaucrats. They're really fearful of a strike led by the rank and file. It would be out of their control. And initially, the CGT leaders, they tried to only call for limited one-day strikes, but the workers were way too angry. And one of the things that angered them, I think, is just the way the students were treated by the cops. It was disgusting. So they were just way too angry to accept that. So the union leaders tried to diffuse the militancy. They try, if they can't stop it, what they'll try and do is put themselves at the head of the movement, and then reroute it into negotiations. Okay, you've had your few days of occupation. Now you all go home and we'll negotiate at the negotiating table, right? That's terrain they're familiar with and one that they can control. And in fact, the CGT took control themselves of many of those strike committees. So they basically kicked out the rank and file workers, and they put their own people on those committees. But even worse, other workers who didn't necessarily have a specific role, they told them during the occupation, well, you should just go home. So when you go home as a worker, you don't get to participate in those mass meetings where people would have debates about strategy, where they get introduced to some more radical ideas they might not have heard before. And what do you do when you go home? Well, in those days, there was no internet, so people just listened to the radio and watched the TV, and that was full of the boss's messages. So, that would have been bad enough. Like, that's really dumb. If you want your strike to succeed, you absolutely shouldn't do that. But why did the PCDF do these things? Well, they were a thoroughly reformist party. When I first learned there was something called a communist party, in Europe, I'm like, oh, communists, they must be really radical. No. They're totally focused on electoralism. They thought they could only make gains by getting into parliament. Sounds familiar, right? Like a social democratic party. So their strategy was, because they were small, to make an alliance with other left parties to become part of a coalition government. That was their goal. But this meant they had to prevent anything radical action that might be a pull towards workers that would be more appealing to workers than what they were proposing. So they had to dampen down that struggle, and they definitely didn't want any violence, right? It didn't matter if the violence is self-defense, they didn't put that fine a point on it. They thought if there was violence that was somehow associated with them and their people, then that would scare off their potential coalition partners, and that would damage their reputation. And they were really trying hard to be legal and use legal channels, and you can kind of see where this is going, right? So the PCF, they kind of at the beginning, they made sure they didn't denounce the occupations, but they certainly didn't encourage them or do anything to help them either. They were trying to kind of walk this line. They were constantly focused on avoiding what they called adventurism. We have to have no adventurism among the workers, but that was just workers fighting back, right? So despite their rhetoric, they talked about unity, but then behind people's backs, they were undermining all kinds of things. And in the end, they deliberately sabotaged, as I said, the strikes and the occupations, and they did actually succeed in derailing the workers' struggles so that they could turn the focus to voting instead. So when President de Gaulle outmaneuvered the left by calling an election and making veiled threats to use armed force if the PCF and the rest of the left didn't respect this election, the PCF was kind of trapped because they had already said they were all about elections. They put all their eggs in that electoral basket. So how could they say no all of a sudden to this election called by de Gaulle, even though, maybe by then they could see, this wasn't going to go their way. So it gets worse because de Gaulle turned to the far right to support him. I think we've seen that before, right, with sort of liberal democracies where they're not afraid of using the far right. Basically gave the right the green light to thugs. Thugs attacked the left. There were injuries of students. People were killed, fly posting, like putting up posters. Can you imagine? And the PCF said nothing because they were afraid of being associated with violence. They didn't want to take a stand. And the right's goons basically, had attacked people, and the PCF didn't defend those activists. They were so keen to be respectable. And then, shamefully, the force didn't get just used against, activists. It got used against the occupations themselves. And what the PCF did is just to try and shut down the occupations. So they went in and they did the old trick where they would lie to the workers in one plant and say, oh, you should settle because the guys in that plant already settled, which was a total lie. And so then the workers thought, oh, everyone else is settling, I guess we better settle. But that wasn't true, right? That totally wasn't true. So this is obviously going to demoralize people, right? So in the end, long story short, de Gaulle swept the elections. They actually did really well. I would imagine partly because of demoralization, partly because of what you said, Zarif, that, the middle class we know can go either way. They're pulled by whoever they see giving a lead. Well, the Communist Party was not giving a lead, so then the middle class is going to vacillate back to support the ruling class. And I think one of the things that we want to take away from this, and just a couple more minutes, was that to try and beat de Gaulle in an election, that was a huge mistake for the left, right? The right has such an advantage in elections. The system is literally set up to support the status quo. That is not our terrain that we should be fighting on. It's so much better to focus on workplaces where workers had the power to stop the right. And there's even a concrete example just from this period of France 68, because there was a bogus referendum called earlier by de Gaulle, and workers said, yeah, we're not going to fall for your bogus referendum, and this is how we're going to stop it. They refused to print any ballots for the referendum. No print shop would print the ballots. So then de Gaulle's people went to Belgium, and the Belgian workers wouldn't print them either. So that's like a perfect example. That's where our power is, right? So how could it have been different? And I'll just take one more minute to talk about that. The cautionary tale, I think, in this story is that in every potentially revolutionary situation, There's an explosion of workers' anger, right? It could be France 68, could be the uprising in Bangladesh, it could be wildcat strikes that can happen here in so-called Canada. There's always going to be a leadership that emerges that are reformist in perspective, who will attempt to demobilize struggle. Not because they're jerks, although some of them might be, but because they see this as channeling the movement into realism or balance, right? Electoral and a union bargaining strategy, that's what they're used to, that's what they've heard of, right? Well, the people at the top, definitely, that's what they want. But even rank and file workers, reformism is what we know, right? It's what we're taught. So something outside of that, that's new and different, and that's why those debates that could have happened in those factories were so important for people to explore. Well, how could it be different, right? What else could we do? So no matter how progressive a reformist leader seems, they have a different perspective on social change. They really can't conceive of letting mass democratic rank and file workers groups make decisions, let them run things. And they just want to return to normalcy. And I experienced this myself when I was on 2-week illegal strike. It was really making our union leaders nervous, even the ones that I thought were radical and that I respected. They just couldn't really wait for it to be over. So, you know, they think that they can just compromise. They think they can have us stand down and then they can negotiate. But after you've demobilized your people, you no longer have the power to negotiate on, right, as he nods, yeah, on an even equal level with your employer, with the state, right? So in the end, sometimes you don't even win the initial small reforms that were on the table, and that's what happened in France. So what's the message? Last thing, one more paragraph. Workers need, or maybe two, workers need organization that's independent of the union and political party structures and these independent rank and file networks. You can't build them overnight. Once the explosion happens, it's kind of too late. You need to start ahead of time. If anybody was involved in Paint the Province Purple, maybe they can talk about how even that didn't just happen in 1 year, right? These things get built ahead of time. So those little networks around the socialist groups that Zarif talked about, they were too small. They were too embryonic. They needed to be bigger. So the experience in France, though, does show one positive, that even one organized socialist in a workplace can have a huge impact if they're part of an organization, right? And they have the right politics, but they have to have roots. Otherwise, no one is going to listen to what they say. And I just, last little bit, I kind of laughed. I read Ian Burchell's quote about reformism, right? Social democracy and basically what the Communist Party was doing. And he said, he talked about the groupuscule, the little groups of lefty students, and that they had contempt for reformism. And he said, that was refreshing, but reformism won't disappear simply by being denounced. So how do we get rid of it? And his argument, and I agree with this, is that the United Front is kind of the answer, right? So we need to have activity where we invite those leaders to join us in activity that would actually push the strike forward, and then they're exposed when, of course, they won't do it. And then their members can see them betraying the movement rather than just taking our word for it. So, in the end, what does France 68 show us? It shows us revolution could happen here. Makes me think of what Fred said last night, right? You know, the strike showed us what is possible. That's the lesson of France 68. It showed us what was possible. And, whether we're fighting for reform or revolution, politics matter. Being organized socialist means being the memory of our class, means we have to pass on these lessons, but we also need to be building these rank and file worker networks and the confidence of workers, so then when the next 1968 France happens, because it could happen here, we have a better chance of winning. Thanks.